So here we are in 1776. The colonies have declared independence from Great Britain. And now the question is, how are we going to form this new nation, this independent nation? You've got 13 disparate colonies that don't really have a whole lot in common other than their linkages to the British Empire. Now, one thing to keep in mind, of course, no taxation without representation is sort of the motto of much of the revolutionary fervor of the 1760s and 1770s. But the colonists themselves, especially the leaders that are sort of provoking this movement towards independence in the 1770s, they are guided by these ideas of republicanism. And that's not connected to the current day political party of the Republicans, but it is an ideology of rejecting aristocracy. So think about old world European aristocracy, that you're born into certain privileges, that there's a need for virtue. And in this context, virtue is self-sacrifice for the public good. A fear of vice or luxury, of greed, of too much wealth, because those things can undermine that virtue, that self-sacrifice for the common good. In order for a republic to survive, you're forming a new type of government, one that has seen the likes of days since ancient Rome and ancient Greece. What is going to be the power that is going to be in the hands of the people. So they need to have virtue. And if they don't have virtue, if they're attracted to vice and luxury, then it's going to undermine the very foundations of that Republican government. Now, the first thing these colonies do is they turn to rewriting their state assemblies, because they turn to rewriting their constitutions, because their founding documents of these colonies had references to king and England, and there are different charters. Some of them had been formed by private companies. Some of them were under royal control. So there needed to be some sort of a founding document for these new independent states. And there was variations across the board between these new 13 states, but overall, you're going to see some affirmation of the fundamental freedoms of religion, speech, and press, as well as some that are focused on freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, as well as the right to trial by jury. And these are all issues that are very much on the minds of colonists in the 1770s. They are reacting to their immediate context and their relationship and the experiences that they had had with Great Britain. Now, the purpose of these constitutions were to express the rights of citizens and to restrain government. So keep that in mind. Now, in general, there's the fear of a powerful executive branch. So you see reduction in powers of governors in these new state constitutions, with powerful legislatures. That is the power within the hands of elected officials in the legislative branch. Typically, voting was limited to white men who owned property. Now, how do we then tie these 13 new states together into a relationship, a central government, a federal government, a national government? And the Articles of Confederation are drafted in 1777. And again, reacting to their immediate context, the colonists are fearful of a strong central government. So they create the Articles and give it this new government, very few powers. It is made up of a single legislative body. Delegates are appointed by the state legislatures. Each state has one vote. You could send several members to this Congress under the Articles of Confederation, but each state was only going to have one vote, no matter how large your state was. There was no executive, and therefore there was no veto power over any laws passed by that Congress. Now, this central government under the Articles, one of its big weaknesses was that it could not tax. And keep in mind, they are in the midst of fighting a war for their independence. And if you cannot raise money through taxation, it is very hard to fund an army and a navy and those sorts of things. All the government could do was ask the various states for contributions, but the states themselves are in debt. They are fielding armies of their own, militias of their own. So it makes for a difficult financial situation. In order to change these articles, you needed the consent of all the states, which is also difficult to do. And in effect, they create a very weak central government under the Articles. Now, one of the things that the Articles did well was actually deal with the acquisition of new lands after the revolution. So after the War for Independence is won and the Paris Peace Treaty of 1783 is signed, it grants the United States all this territory between the Mississippi River east to the Atlantic Ocean. Now, much of this land is controlled by Native Americans, but on paper anyways, it belongs to the United States. And they then have to come up with a process for acquiring this territory, for making these territories into states. And there was questions: is this territory out west, this land that is not part of the original 13 states, are they going to come into the Union as equal to those that are already established, to the states that are already established, or are they going to be sort of pseudo colonies of the eastern states? Kentucky and Tennessee had already been sort of invaded, if you want to use that word, by white settlers who were desirous of the lands there. And it was, in both cases, especially Kentucky, sort of bloody and chaotic, and led to a lot of litigation and warfare with Native Americans. And the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, wanted to sidestep that bloody and chaotic process. So in 1787, they passed what's known as the Northwest Ordinance. And this, again, is a process for taking these lands, making them into territories, and then for them to become states. So once there was a population of 5,000 people, let's say, in the area that becomes the state of Ohio, then they could form a General Assembly. And then at 60,000, they could write their own state constitution and apply for statehood. Now, the important thing here to remember is that this applies only to these lands north and west of the Ohio River. And in order to become a state, they had their state constitutions had to include a Bill of Rights and outlaw slavery. So this is going to sort of set the North and South against one another as far back as 1787, which eventually will culminate in the American Civil War, which begins in 1861. But this was an effective process for transforming these lands from territories into states. And you can see there very quickly in the early 19th century anyways, you get a handful of states from Ohio in 1803, Indiana in 1816, Illinois a couple of years later in 1818. A more orderly process than, again, what had occurred in Kentucky or Tennessee. Now, the 1780s were a challenge for this new United States. Europe is looking on very eagerly. They are okay if this new republic would fail. Then these are monarchies in Europe, and they're not exactly wishing us the best of luck. Now, the economy is a major issue for the colonists. You have debt is very widespread. Individuals are in debt, the states are in debt, and the national government under the Articles is in debt because everyone's borrowed money to wage this war. There had been various non-importation agreements, boycotts against British goods before the war. And now that the war is over, those cheap goods that are going to come flooding into American markets. Great Britain's going through the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. So those are going to put cheap goods to compete with American-made goods. And it's going to end up leading to a lot of gold, that hard money, leaving the United States and going to Europe. And it's going to leave the United States with a worthless paper currency. And you have these individuals themselves who are unable to pay taxes on their farms, and they're going to have their lands foreclosed upon, and then their right to vote is going to be up in the air, because if you're not a landowner in most states, you don't have the right to vote. And you suddenly have people questioning, well, what is independence? What does independence mean if we are indebted to these foreign nations? In 1786 and 87, you have an uprising in Western Massachusetts by small farmers led by a Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays. And these were farmers who were having their farms foreclosed upon. So what they do is they say, we're going to close the courts. The courts are the institution of the state, the governing institution that is local and that is closing down and taking our farms. So we're going to attack those courts. Now, as this rebellion, which grew to up to 4,000 farmers on the frontier, as this is occurring, you have leaders of the revolutionary movement of the 1770s very concerned. George Washington is watching this, worried that this whole experiment and republicanism is failing, within a decade of independence. So you have these nationalists like James Madison that you see here in your upper left, Alexander Hamilton at the bottom, who had, even before Shays' Rebellion, had been calling for a stronger central government. That they had realized that the Articles of Confederation were just too weak and not up to the task of the 1780s, the challenges that this decade was posing to the United States. But Shays' Rebellion is what's going to convince many more people that we do, in fact, need a national government. Because what happens with Shays is the leaders of Massachusetts, they petitioned the Articles of Confederation, the Congress under the Articles, and asked for help in putting down this internal rebellion. And this weak central government under the article says that's a state matter. It's not a national matter. You're going to have to deal with it yourself. So again, that's going to convince many leaders, especially, that in order to safeguard their property and their status, they're going to have to build a stronger central government. So in May of 1787, delegates from 12 states travel to Philadelphia, and under the guise of revising the Articles of Confederation, they throw them out and they write what becomes the United States Constitution. It's important to remember that these delegates were not representative of the people. They were amongst the elites. They were all white men. They were lawyers and plantation owners up from the upper crust of society. And this was a secret process. The only reason we know anything about it is because James Madison kept a very detailed journal of the proceedings that we can look back upon. But other than that, nobody was quite sure what was going on within the convention hall in Philadelphia during that hot summer of 1787. Now, one of the things that they debated is how is representation in this new federal government under the Constitution going to be organized? Now, James Madison's from Virginia, and he is sort of the architect of this Constitution. And he comes in and he says, let's have a two-house Congress. That is a bicameral Congress. One of them will be elected from the people. The other one will be appointed by the states. And the representation, the number of people you have in that Congress, will be proportional to how large your state is, based on the population. We'll have an executive branch, and that executive will be elected by Congress, not by the people, and they will have a veto power. Now, the smaller states like New Jersey or Rhode Island are looking at Madison's Virginia plan with suspicion, because they realize that Virginia, as the largest state, is going to wield a lot of power under this scheme if it were to go into effect. So William Patterson, another delegate to the convention from New Jersey, puts forth his own plan. He says, no, let's keep a unicameral or a one-house Congress like we already have. One state, one vote, which is already in effect under the Articles, but we'll just give Congress stronger powers to tax and to regulate trade and whatnot. And so in a lot of ways, this is just keeping the Congress as it was, the national government as it was under the Articles, but just strengthening it a bit. Now, there's going to be a compromise known as the Connecticut Compromise, and that's going to be brokered by Roger Sherman. And what they come up with is pretty much what we have now, right? A bicameral legislative body. So our Congress has two houses. We have an upper house with an equal number of representatives from each state. That's the Senate. Every state gets two senators, no matter how big or small you are. The lower house gets a representation by population. And at the time, it was one representative for every 30,000 citizens. Now, the question then between the North and the South, as the North is gradually moving away from slavery at this time because of economic reasons mostly, and the South is beginning to double down and expand on their slave population, is how are enslaved peoples going to be counted towards population? Southern delegates, of course, want their enslaved peoples, who they deny humanity, they deny their legal personhood, but they want them to count towards population, towards representation, so that they can acquire and maintain more power in this new federal government. The North says, well, no, if you're not going to give these people legal rights, if you're not going to consider them citizens, then they should not count towards your population and for terms of representation in Congress. Now, the Constitution itself at this time does not mention slavery, does not mention enslaved peoples. They refer to them as other persons or people bound to service. And eventually the compromise here for how enslaved peoples will be counted for purposes of representation is what's known as the 3/5 clause. So for every 5 enslaved people is going to count for as 3 free white men as purposes of population for representation. So even though this is not giving the South all that they want, that is counting all their enslaved people as full people for representation purposes, it is giving them a large advantage and disproportionate power in this new federal government, which they will maintain all the way up until the outbreak of the Civil War. Now, part of this bargain, again, helps out the South, which is the North wants to end the transatlantic slave trade. And the South fears that Congress will pass restrictive trade regulations when it comes to slavery. And so the compromises will end the slave trade, but we won't do so for 20 years. So if you are a slave owner, you're thinking, well, the value of my property will only go up once this trade is cut off, because you're cutting off a source of that commodity from coming in. So what is already present within the United States, those enslaved people will be, the price of them, the value of them will go up. The South also wrangles out a fugitive slave clause. So the South is getting pretty much all that they want, and the North is bowing to the pressure of these Southern slave owners in the convention, because they fear the South keeps claiming or threatening to leave the Union before this Constitution can even be ratified. So what the Constitution eventually creates is a federal system that is a sharing of power between national and state governments. And you can see the various ways, some of the shared powers, such as raising taxes and providing for the public welfare, and then also those powers that are held strictly by the national government. For instance, the state of Tennessee cannot declare war on Mexico or Canada, right? Only the national government can declare war. Only the national government can create and maintain armed forces, establish foreign policy, etc. The powers reserved for the states include local governments, maintaining schools, regulating trade within your state, etc. So now the next thing is these 55 delegates or so in Philadelphia have written this new form of government. Now what do? There's no playbook here. It's not put into effect yet. So they decide, well, let's say 9 out of 13 states have to agree with this, and then it'll go into effect. And so they send it off to the states to debate over. And that's where you get debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists, those that are for the Constitution and those that have qualms about it, if not being outright against it. And eventually you'll get the Bill of Rights, which is going to more strongly state the rights of individuals and the restraints on the federal government itself.